everybody. This is Dr. Lori Shemek.
And I'm Omar Cumberbatch. You're listening to This Podcast Burns Fat. Hey, Lori, how are you today?
I am doing wonderful. How are you doing?
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I'm doing some home remodeling, so if I sneeze, forgive me. Lots of concrete dust everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's hard to go through that.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
It'll be worth it in the end, but I get it.
I know. It will be worth it. I keep saying that to myself. What else is worth it is we have journalist Gary Taubes. He's an investigative science and health journalist and the co-founder of the nonprofit Nutrition Science Initiative. He's a best-selling author of The Case Against Sugar, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, and Good Calories and Bad Calories. And his latest book is very compelling, science-based, but very readable, called The Case For Keto. And Gary is just really, I love what he does because he researches, he takes his time, and he puts the science out there. And, you know, we all have really are attracted to one type of belief or another in terms of eating and how it's metabolized and carbohydrates and insulin and all that. But his really makes a huge difference, I think, his work.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm such a big fan of his. And I know that we spoke about it. He was actually probably the first nutrition book I've ever read was by Gary Taubes. So he kind of started me on the path of investigating on my own, reading this kind of literature. And I really thank you, Lori, for having this podcast with me so I could actually speak to him in person, which is like a dream come true.
Right. So. I know. I'm with you. I'm with you, Omar, on that one. Yeah. That's one thing I love about this podcast is we get great guests like Gary. So
absolutely.
Without further ado,
yes, let's jump into the show.
Yeah.
Hey, Gary, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Gary. We are so very happy you're here today. We've been really looking forward to this. And, you know, we've both known about you for a long time. You have been around for a while. I mean, you are a New York Times bestselling author. You've written, for Good Calories, Bad Calories, the New York Times Magazine. And your most recent book is The Case for Keto. So, you know, I know you've written a lot, and I know our audience members know who you are. And another book you've written is called The Case for Sugar. And
Case Against Sugar.
Yeah. And that's that.
If I wrote The Case for Sugar, that would be interesting and short.
And if anybody can do it, you could. But so I would love for you to describe what brought you to really this point in your journey in a nutshell, you know, to where you are right now. I mean, just quickly, you know, not your whole life story.
No. Okay. Yeah. So my interest pre-nutrition was good science and bad science and controversial science and how hard it is to do science right. Mm-hmm. And I stumbled into the nutrition field in the late 90s and a couple of very lengthy investigative articles for the journal Science. And I realized that nutritionists had a different conception of doing science right than I did. And that mine might be more reliable as it was actually based on good science. Anyway, so I did a series of investigations. I did this infamous New York Times Magazine cover story called "What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie?" That I guess in about 10 days will be the 20-year anniversary.
Wow.
And, you know, that just got me started on researching this. And it was, you know, my research came at a period in time when the internet suddenly made it available for people who weren't, you know, living in major academic centers to access virtually all of the world's literature going back to the very, you know, earliest papers. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to do, for my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, pretty much a lifetime's worth of work in 5 years. And I've been mining that in various ways ever since, sort of spinning off chapters that deserve them to be books, or in the latest, the Case for Keto, now that this movement we've been involved with has evolved to the point that so many physicians around the world are involved in it as well, to, prescribing to their patients low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets. I was able to sort of reach out to them and interview, in that case, over 120 physicians to get a feel for the challenges that they face and the challenges that their patients face and what they've been learning from this process, and putting it together with sort of how my thinking had evolved over that 20 years.
Yeah, that's amazing, because I did read many of your earlier books. I'm a big fan, and I really see like there is an evolution, even though it's something that I guess you kind of always intimated was a low carb phenomenon. How has your perspective changed and evolved in at least the low carb hemisphere?
Well, it's interesting because in many ways I'm also a dinosaur. So when I started this research, right, the ketogenic diet was known as Atkins.
Right.
Now there are people who somehow think there's a huge difference between going keto and going Atkins and going low carb. So what I was trying to do in this latest book is just figure out how all this gets translated to advice given to the public and the patients. So on one level, to me, it's all very simple. It comes down to this question: are carbohydrates, for those of us who fatten easily, are carbohydrates fattening? And to describe some of the ways I never really thought about this before, which I admit to in the book to being kind of embarrassed about, you get this huge debate, for instance, we were just discussing it off air on Twitter between people, the athletes and bodybuilders and the exercise physiologists who say, of course, carbohydrates aren't fattening. I train these distance athletes and they live on carbohydrates. And the bodybuilders say, well, I train these bodybuilders and they live on carbohydrates. So how can you say carbohydrates are fattening? And something I never said outright in my earliest books, although it's implied always, is that there's a difference, physiological difference between those of us who get fat and those of us who don't. It's obvious to anyone who grows up in a family in which you have lean siblings and, siblings who struggle with their weight, and whichever way you go. Anyway, so the phrase I used in the latest book is just some of us fatten easily and some don't. And for those who don't, they can tolerate and maybe thrive on the carbohydrate content of the modern American diet. But for those of us who do, we can't. It's the carbohydrates that for us are fattening. And then we can't eat them. And then the question becomes, once you start abstaining from carbohydrates, is there some added benefit to being in ketosis? Or is a ketosis just a marker for someone who's doing the best job possible of abstaining from carbohydrates? You get into all these issues that, as a journalist, I can try to address because I have no dog in the fight. If I'm a physician and I'm writing a book about this, I have to kind of come up with some patent claim to make my book appear different than everyone else's book.
Exactly.
But as a journalist, I can say, hey, these doctors say this and those doctors say that, and I kind of believe those doctors, but we really don't have the evidence. So maybe you should try either way.
Yeah.
And this last book, The Case for Keto, it was originally called How to Think About How to Eat. And then it was supposed to come out in May of 2020. So that was 2 months into the COVID shutdowns. And in March of 2020, a book was being published by David Katz, a nutritionist associated peripherally with Yale University, and the best-selling New York Times columnist Mark Bittman, called How to Eat. So we had to change the title of my How to Think About How to Eat, and we opted for The Case.
I like that title better. Case for Keto. Yeah.
It's just that it's kind of the case for avoiding carbohydrates because they're fattening.
Right. Which we'll go into.
Yeah.
Which we will go into. So, we have this unprecedented epidemic of obesity and diabetes. And, and all of us are thinking, how did we get here? And so it makes me think about the low-fat diet era, Ancel Keys, perhaps, or any. What are your feelings about that? Your opinion on this?
Okay, so clearly that was the question I was trying to address when I started this research with the New York Times Magazine piece. What if it's all big fat lie? We've got these epidemics. What's triggering them? What's interesting is we're not the only population having these epidemics. So you see these epidemics everywhere in the world where a traditional population goes from eating whatever their traditional diet is, whatever their traditional diet was, to a Western diet. And that nutrition transition, as it's called, as it goes along with a disease transition from whatever diseases these populations might have suffered from to Western diseases, which are obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, this whole spectrum of diseases that associate together. And so the obvious question is, what is it about this Western diet and lifestyle that triggers that phenomena? And the conventional wisdom is people just eat too much and they become sedentary as they get westernized. So they go from being subsistence farmers to, sitting on tractors instead of out actually walking the fields. And this caloric imbalance or eating too much, they're not getting enough physical activity, causes the obesity, and that causes everything else. And the argument that I make in my books is you add pretty much sugar and white flour to any population's diet, and you eventually get these obesity and diabetes epidemics and all that follows. So sugar is maybe necessary, but the two together, sugar and flour, are necessary and sufficient to cause the epidemics we're seeing. And then in the United States, there's this added issue. So the question becomes, why is it obesity rates were kind of stable around 10, 12% of the population until the late 1970s, when we initiated this idea that high-fat diets, high-saturated fat diets cause heart disease. We should all eat low-fat diets and replace the fat with carbs. And this became sort of the national prescribed diet.
Right.
Happened right in the mid-'80s. It sort of begins in the late 70s. So it's totally coincident with the obesity epidemic as documented in these national surveys. And so the idea is, until the 1960s, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates were fattening. And then because of Ancel Keys and all these other people implying that dietary fat causes heart disease, the carbohydrate goes from being inherently fattening to sort of a heart-healthy diet food.
That was just an amazing switch. I'll never forget that. Yeah.
And now when you have people struggling with obesity and diabetes as well, and struggling with their weight, the advice they get is precisely the wrong advice. So instead of being told, as Atkins was saying, don't eat carbs because they're fattening, they're now told to avoid fat, avoid butter and oil and fatty meat. And because animal products have so much fat in it, the more carbs you get, the better. And so we should all eat precisely the foods that are driving this epidemic. Even sugar was perceived as benign during this period because fat was the problem. And the classic example, my favorite, is Jane Brody, who was the personal health reporter at the New York Times. Yeah, right. And Jane had written a best-selling best-selling food books called The Good Food Book. And in the 1985 version, she says, we used to tell people not to eat pasta because we thought it was fattening, but we were wrong. It's one of the few times any journalist ever admitted to being wrong, except that she was actually right.
So maybe that's why they don't admit they're wrong anymore, because they might spin back and be right.
You never know. Anyway, that was like, so that's boom, great. Now we're going to tell you, if you're getting heavy, eat exactly the wrong foods. go ahead.
Or if you have diabetes. Yeah.
Well, diabetes, I'm working on a book on diabetes now.
Oh, fantastic. And, I can't wait to read it.
It's a history of the diabetes science and a history of how medical science works. I think it's pretty good, but my editor has not confirmed that yet.
Fantastic. Oh, I know it's good.
Yeah. Anyway, the 1971, based on this idea that saturated fat might cause heart disease, and people suffering with diabetes are at high risk of dying of atherosclerosis and heart disease, the American Diabetes Association starts telling everyone, they changed their guides. It's their second edition of their guidelines. And for the first time in history, they're going to tell patients with diabetes they should eat even more carbohydrates than the public at large because of their heart disease risk. And the whole book, in effect, asks this question: why is it that for 50, 60 years, patients with diabetes have been told that they should get most of their calories from the one macronutrient they cannot metabolize without pharmaceutical assistance? And we did that because we were afraid that the fat would cause heart disease. So
that's a sad story.
It is. It's a tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
No, it really is, because Gary, I mean, at the end of the day, we know carbs have always been with us. It's not like this is a new thing. Do you think even before the Ansel Keys influence and the other things that were going on at the time, were people just able to manage carbs better? And if so, why?
Well, they were a different type of carbs. And this is the kind of problem. I mean, you still see this today. And again, I guess Twitter is the repository for every idiotic argument you can imagine. But so the idea is, and this was always the feedback, well, what about, Gary, if you're saying carbs are the problem, what about Southeast Asia? Here's several billion people who live on high carb diets, and they do fine. But the kinds of carbs they lived on were different. So they were, not machine processed, and very low sugar. So what happens with time is when populations become westernized, they tend to eat fewer carbohydrates as a percentage of their calories, but the carbohydrates they consume change dramatically in the processing, in effect. So they go from eating minimally processed carbohydrates to, we might call them maximally processed carbohydrates, of which, the iconic example would be Coca-Cola and Pepsi. So you change the nature of the carbs to a form that these populations, these individuals can't really metabolize, and then you start getting all the problems that come from there. But it's not the amount of carbs they eat, it's the quality of the carbohydrates that changes so dramatically.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And I think a really important piece of this that I've heard you speak about are the industrial seed oils or industrial oils that are used in foods and for cooking.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what to make of the industrial seed oil argument. And when you look at these population transitions, and because so much of the work I did was based on sort of the historical observations as they evolved with time from the mid 19th century onward, you start to see the appearance of these obesity and diabetes epidemics in populations, as well as hypertension. And then once they start measuring cholesterol, high cholesterol, and the appearance of heart disease and stroke in these populations, and even cancer, at all times with the first contact, the first westernizations of the diet, which are, again, adding sugar and flour. Nobody's talking about adding seed oils. And some of these populations in India and Asia were eating, were getting seed oils in their diets. And then you add sugar and, white bread, and you see the manifestations of these disorders. So I could imagine that it makes things worse, that it magnifies the effect. And there are some studies showing this in animals, but in animals, there are studies that show virtually anything you want them to show. So it's always dangerous to use.
And also, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, could use animal experiments when you're talking about sort of biological mechanisms, physiological mechanisms that might be conserved from species to species, or genetic mechanisms. But when you're talking about the interactions with diet, they fall apart. Anyway, so that's, the flip side is maybe I missed the seed oil story and I refuse to accept it. And that's, that's
a teaspoon of canola oil a day, Gary.
Exactly.
But there's also speculation that combining sugar with fat actually helps create more of an inflammatory effect.
Yeah, it's possible. And again, these are the kinds of questions that you could, if you did the experiments with humans, you could test it. And here's where this is. So when I got into this, when I wrote that first piece in 2002, I had gone off I had a friend who was an editor at the New York Times Magazine. We had decided I was going to do a story trying to establish what the start of the obesity epidemic, what might have triggered the epidemic. It was new enough back then that this was an interesting story. And in the course of my research for these science investigations, I had a couple of suggestions made to me. One was a NIH administrator who said, we told everybody to go on low-fat diets and we thought they'd get thinner, and they got fatter. And another was this idea high fructose corn syrup came in, also coincident with the epidemic. And so those were the two theories.
Right.
As I was doing the article, as I was doing the research, I came upon 5 studies that had been done testing the Atkins diet, randomized controlled trials looking at the Atkins diet versus the kind of low-fat, calorie-restricted diet that the American Heart Association was recommending. None of these had been published yet, but they'd been discussed in conferences, so I could discuss them in the article. And here's the point. This is what makes those studies so sort of important in this world. What we know from these studies is if you tell people not to eat carbohydrates and replace those carbohydrates with fat, they get healthier, at least in the short run, at least over the course of the trials. And they get healthier than if you tell them to, try and avoid fat and eat less food in general. So we know that if you eat high-fat diets, you will get healthier, at least for a year or two. And we know that if you eat sugar and fat diets, you won't. But what we don't have is a trial that compares sort of a sugar high-fat diet versus a sugar low-fat diet, which is the implication which is kind of what you need to know if the sugar-fat combination is worse than the sugar-low-fat combination. You know what I'm saying?
The low-fat era was one example.
And the low-fat era was an example of everything going wrong in terms of advice. But you can't really put your finger on what it was. Again, I tell people to eat carbs, tell them they could eat sugar. Had they been healthier if they had eaten less fat? And the problem is even the people advocating for low-fat diets like Dean Ornish are also telling their patients to avoid sugar and white flour for the same reason we do, which is they stimulate insulin secretion and insulin resistance. And you end up with a metabolic milieu that fosters death.
Literally.
So it's sort of, so there's no evidence to really I don't find the evidence to allow me to say, look, sugar with fat is worse than sugar with less fat or sugar with more fat. I found animal studies in my research that suggested that saturated fat was actually particularly noxious in a high sugar diet.
Right.
But the Atkins studies tell you that, or the keto studies, however you want to call them, tell you that saturated fat seems to be benign when you don't have the sugar in the diet. So I'm going to focus on the sugar and not the level of fat.
I think one thing I remember when I read your book, back a couple of years, well, I should say many, many years ago, I think that you kind of closed one of the arguments that was prevalent during this whole epidemic of really just the calorie in, calorie out model, and really address that this is a hormonal situation. Can you speak on that? And do you still agree that that's the case?
Oh yeah, no, that's but it wasn't closed. So yeah, the general thing, I mean, this is so there's several pillars of sort of dogma on which all nutrition theory is based. And the two that really influence the way we eat the most are this idea that we get fat because we consume too many calories. We eat too much, simplest way to put it. And then the idea that high fat diets, high saturated fat diets give you heart disease. So those two pillars kind of drive everything that happens from the 1970s onward. The idea that we get fat because you eat too much just seems to make intuitive sense. It's like even in that 2002 New York Times article, I still believed it. There's a clause in there where I say, and surely we get fat because we take in more calories than we expend. This is this calories in, calories out, or Chico model. And in the course of my research, one of the things you learn is that it's a hypothesis that dates back to when physicians first start speculating as to the cause of obesity. And it seems some people eat a lot of food and are obese. Falstaff in Shakespeare is like the classic example. So we're going to assume that they get fat because they eat so much. And other people seem not to eat much at all and are still obese. And, my Aunt Matilda. And so we're going to assume that their obesity is hormonal. And so you had these kind of two hypotheses. And then beginning in 1930, this one University of Michigan researcher claims that he's experimentally proven that everyone gets fat because they eat too much. And through this chain of events that I document in my book, that becomes the conventional wisdom, to the point that in 1993, when the hormone leptin is discovered and obesity research becomes a sort of subdiscipline of the field of molecular biology, the researchers who discover it that are looking for the hormone that might explain why people who get fat eat too much, why they can't control their appetite. So this hormone leptin is described as a satiety or a hunger hormone because it's supposedly the signal from the fat tissue to the brain telling us to stop eating. The problem is there's all kinds of problems with this calories in, calories out thinking. Like,
for instance, obese people had a lot of it, of leptin.
That was one of the problems with leptin. Yeah. I mean, the problems with the leptin science is.
So there goes that theory.
Well, then that's when it becomes the idea is that it's not a satiety hormone, it's a hunger hormone. And so the absence of leptin makes you hungry, but having too much leptin, then you're leptin resistant. So anyway, it gets very complicated.
Yeah.
The calories in, calories out model also had all kinds of problems. So the most obvious, which was I first saw in the sort of seminal metabolic textbook of the 1920s, is in order to maintain your weight, you've got to perfectly balance your calories into your calories out. So, if you're off by 10, 20 calories a day, that's, which is like 2 almonds. That's 2 pounds of fat you're storing every year, which is like 20 pounds of fat in a decade, which is 40 pounds of fat between, college graduation and the first time you start thinking about buying a Porsche. That's supposed to be a midlife crisis joke.
I got it.
But it was only male related. I can't figure out what the
female side.
Yeah. You can tell me off air what the female.
Okay, let me think about that one.
You know, I mean, in this day and age, I'm already assuming now I've somehow been canceled retroactively.
Gary.
But we'll go on with the interview anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's it. 40 pounds. If you're off by 20 calories a day, and you know, these research would point out. So not only the question wasn't why does anyone get fat? The question is how does anyone stay lean?
Exactly. It's like, you can't, it's mathematically impossible to.
It's mathematically. And then we live in a world in which it's not just the food industry with their ultra processed food and every chef who's ever lived has dedicated his life to trying to make sure people eat more food than they would otherwise without his cooking. Yeah, the whole science, like cocktails and snacks and the whole shebang, it's all dedicated. I'm actually paraphrasing the leading obesity researcher at the Mayo Clinic in the late 30s, when everything is aimed at getting us to eat too much. And if we overshoot by 20 calories a day, we're going to get obese. How does anyone stay lean?
Yeah. And that's just, to me, it's a huge question about how, you know, like we started out with, how did we get here? Because, you know, what has changed in the last 100 years when you stop and think about it, right? We're much thinner, leaner, but our genes haven't changed. And for the most part, there's some heritability, but that's another story, but not overall. Right now we're at what, 43% obese?
Yeah, it's crap. We all do this thing, I'm sure you do it, where, you know, you see old photos from the 70s and before, and you look for people who suffer from obesity.
You have to look. Yeah.
And you have to find. And some of them, you just don't find it. And yet it is the norm. I do think, by the way, it's not so much that genes don't change, but the epigenetic manifestation of the genes.
Right. And that's my question is, what do you think has created or shifted this fat storage?
Well, and so that's what, you know, and there's this idea of fetal programming. So in the womb, the fetus sees the blood sugar and insulin environment of its mother, basically. And as the mother is eating these carb-rich, sugar-rich meals and becoming insulin resistant, and then, you know, blood sugar is elevated. And so the idea is the child in the womb evolves and affect insulin secreting cells in its pancreas. And so it's born predisposed to become heavier and have less control of its blood sugar than the mother's generation. And each generation passes this on to its children through the womb. And so I think I think at the moment we are indeed sort of giving birth to a generation that's predisposed to be thicker than their parents. I mean,
go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm probably the heaviest Taubes that ever lived. And it's not because I get to eat more food than my father's generation or his father's generation, but that by the time I was born, this carb-rich, sugar-rich environment was already changing the sort of conditions in the womb in which I evolved. And then, you know, I came out with this predisposition to become thick, for lack of a better word.
Athletically thick.
I was more, it was athletically. I was more of an athlete. I never struggled with obesity. But for instance, I have an older brother who couldn't put on fat if he tried.
Oh, interesting.
And he ate more than I did. He used to say, I never get stuffed. I just get bored of eating after a couple of hours.
That's amazing.
It's one of my problems. Even nowadays, we talk about a lot of people throw around this term overeating. And it's an interesting term because you can't define overeating unless you know that the person who is in theory overeating is gaining weight or not.
You know, that's a really great observation, truly, you know, because it's subjective, isn't it?
It's completely, so it's a judgment you make based on whether or not you know that they're getting heavier. However, they have to be getting fatter, because if it's like a adolescent, you have a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, they're getting heavier, but they're not putting on fat, they're growing. So you have to know whether they're actually getting fatter. And if you do, then you say they're overeating. And then when you say, well, what's making them get fat? And the answer is, well, they're overeating. They're taking in more calories than they expend. And it's like, dude, do you recognize a tautology, circular logic when you give it? And then I've actually said this to researchers, and you get this look, I call it the cognitive dissonance stare, where their kind of eyes sort of retreat into their heads. They look inward for a bit, trying to wrestle with this.
I love that. And that's what I love about what you do, is that you actually set the record straight, in my opinion, about the truth when it comes to this. And for a lack of a better word, what they're publishing, they're talking about, your even colleagues, as I call it, rubbish. But essentially you're telling them they made a mistake and that they never looked at their paradigm critically. And so I think that's a really, important thing that you're doing.
Yeah, it is. I'd like to think it is, but it's one of the problems with it. The goal of good science. Again, I spent the early years of my career watching scientists, studying scientists as they were making mistakes about what they thought they were discovering. They were discovering non-existent phenomena. And one of the things you always want to do as a scientist is never commit to having discovered something or having observed something fully, because there's always this huge likelihood that you're wrong. And once you commit to a belief, and this is like in obesity, it was this fellow from the University of Michigan claiming in 1930 that he had proven that obesity was always caused by overeating. Then other scientists will come along and make a sort of secondary mistake, which is to assume you were right and to build on what you did without redoing the experiments and critically analyzing what you had done to begin with. And then you get generation of scientists building their edifice on top of what's ultimately a mistake that was made originally. And the whole thing is wrong.
And
you can't get people, the problem is people grow up in that edifice. They're funded to do research that exists only in that edifice. Their whole lives, everyone they know believes that edifice is solid. And they raise up, they become professors, and then they become deans, and they become chairs of commissions, and they get awards, all based on believing exactly what everyone else in their peer group believes. All of which, when you go back into history, you can find was basically built on a mistake. And there's almost nobody, we are not wired, none of us are wired to be able to say, my whole career is built on a mistake. I was just wrong. And as soon as you do that, you also alienate yourself from everyone else you know. It's like, a Catholic deciding that maybe the Muslims got it right.
Right. That's
and then you got to go to the Muslim church, the mosque, because your friends aren't going to want to hear this anymore. You don't want to be the guy who's saying, hey, by the way, this Christ thing.
Right. You don't want to be that guy.
Yeah. So it's it's a real mess. I mean,
but you have been courageous in taking that on. And so I really applaud you for that.
Yeah, no, I give you a lot of credit, because again, these things, I mean, you see it more today now than ever that, a voice of dissent or just a disagreement just gets their head chopped off. So I think my question is, like, do you ever feel like you're beating a dead horse and like say, why am I doing this kind of research, even though obviously me and Lori appreciate it a lot, millions of others, but you are going and swimming in upstream. So I just wanted you to talk about that experience a little bit and how you deal with it.
Well, it's easier to beat the dead horse than to walk away. So on some level, it doesn't take, once I got into this, I was kind of stuck. I always think, the Al Pacino at the end of Godfather 3, he says, I keep trying to get out and they keep trying to pull me back. But in my case, I pull my, there's still, like, I write books that I think need to be written. And even my latest book on diabetes, it's a more of an academic history of the science, because that's what interested me. And I'll lose readers by not just writing a how-to book, but I'm doing what interests me. Fighting the establishment is kind of a necessary aspect of this, because people are getting actively harmed, by the advice that they're being given by these medical organizations. And, this sort of tragedy is being perpetuated with the bad advice. So assuming I believe I'm right, then it's hard to walk away from that. And, I don't have an alternative career. What else? There are people out there who say, well, Taubes only says what he says because he's in it for the money. And I want to say, well, yeah, it's true. I get a paycheck for doing what I do. And there's nothing else I could do where anyone's willing to give me a paycheck. So there is a financial aspect to this, but I am also lucky enough to find the subject matter fascinating, important, and to be obsessed with, this process of trying to find reliable knowledge in this mess of everything from anecdotal evidence to thousands of journal articles that come out every month to... it's interesting, the diabetes book, you find people in like 1915 complaining that the medical literature on diabetes is already too voluminous to understand. And there was about probably, 1/1,000,000th the articles being published then that have been published since.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. And, you in your book, your last book, The Case for Keto, it makes a really strong case for lowering carbohydrates to achieve weight loss and optimizing health. And so if you could just talk about, some of the benefits of maybe people will experience potentially on keto.
Yeah, well, so this is the idea, the diseases, these chronic diseases we suffer from, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, cancer, which is something I never thought I'd say, are all related to this condition called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance seems, you read the biochemistry literature, to be clearly caused by ultimately the effect of the carbohydrates in the diet, the sugars and refined grains. And once we suffer from these diseases, we have to avoid these foods. So the essence of the low carb, high fat ketogenic diet is, what I'm quoting this 1825 Frenchman in the most famous book ever written about food. It's more or less rigid abstinence to the carbohydrates in the diet. And when you do that, and now we have dozens to a couple hundred clinical trials demonstrating that when you avoid these carbs and replace the calories with mostly fat, weight comes down, blood pressure comes down, heart disease risk factors improve dramatically. All these risks for chronic diseases get better. People just get healthier. And as these physicians said, and then those of us who eat this way have experienced, this isn't something, when one of the interesting phenomena when we told people to go on a low-fat diet back 40, 50 years ago, it was in order to prevent heart disease. So the idea is you would eat this way and you would lessen your risk of having a heart attack like 20, 30, 40 years later, but you never actually experience that. You don't experience a disease being prevented. So for instance, if I were to, die at 90 or die at 70, you don't know if my diet, caused me to die 10 years prematurely or extended my life by 10 years. Like there's no information we get in that way. And so what happened with this low-fat diet is doctors were told to sort of prescribe diets based on this hypothesis that their patients will live longer. And they got no feedback other than maybe looking at LDL cholesterol levels. But if they looked at other heart disease risk factors, that LDL cholesterol would be balanced by deleterious effects on other risk factors.
Mm-hmm.
You tell someone or you choose to go on a low carb, high fat, ketogenic diet, you just get healthier. You can actually see that happen. So you can experience the process of getting healthy. I mean, there might be some transition issues because you're changing your body from fundamentally burning carbs for fuel to burning fat and ketones. And people have issues with that. So for some people, there's a few weeks where they feel funky, lacking energy. But for most people who do this, you can actually see them if you're the doctor getting healthier, and you could experience that as the patient. And it's a pretty profound phenomena to go through. It's not just like I ate less and I lost a little weight, but I was hungry all the time. So, to say that one of the reasons low carb doctors like Atkins were perceived as quacks is they used to say, well, everything gets better on these diets. You got psoriasis, well, that gets better. You got Alzheimer's, that gets better. You get, it turns out that
but don't touch that saturated fat.
Yeah, but don't touch that saturated fat. Turns out that many of things in there now, clinical trials showing there's many things, we know that blood pressure comes down and HDL, the good cholesterol goes up and triglycerides come down and, 20 other risk factors for heart disease improve on these diets. And weight, which is the single most important risk factor for heart disease, tends to normalize, and blood sugar control normalizes. I mean, all these things get better. Wonderful. And the clinical trials clearly demonstrate that. And the patients actually experience it. Like the low fat thing, you don't know if you're going to live longer because God doesn't give us that information.
Right.
But what you know is that you will feel better after doing this. And then the question is up to the patient is, do you want to sustain that feeling of good health, or do you want to go back to eating the way you used to eat with all the problems and then the medications necessary for those problems? And
it's like a no-brainer, really.
Yeah. It should be.
Gary, what do you eat?
I eat pretty much. I mean, what I don't eat is grains and starches and legumes and sugar. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was just curious.
It's, it's funny. I played college football. I have weighed as much as 240 pounds. My ideal weight as an adult is probably 210 or 215. I'm still reasonably well muscled for a 66-year-old man who can't do a lot of things he used to do when he was younger. Anyway,
the knees go first.
I eat a lot of food.
Yeah,
when I was younger, I ate enormous amounts of food, and I could eat 3 pounds of pasta at a sitting. I could go through a loaf of bread or 2 baskets of, chips and salsa before the meal came. I was that kind of eater.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and you just miss it. I mean, I had the experience of being a smoker when I was younger, for good or bad. And then smoking is an interesting metaphor because people who smoke cigarettes can't imagine that they could enjoy life without them. And smoking is probably, you wake up, you have a cigarette, you eat breakfast, you have a cigarette, you walk to work, you have a cigarette, or you walk to the bus or to the car. You have a cigarette between meals. Back when you could smoke in restaurants between courses. It's like I lived in France for a while. Sitting in a cafe with a cup of coffee is an unsatisfying experience. Sitting in a cafe with a cup of coffee and a cigarette is nirvana. This is
where coffee got its bad rep.
Yeah, really, probably. Anyway, but then I spent 20 years trying to quit cigarettes. I finally managed to do it. For the first 3 weeks, you're miserable. Miserable. All you could think about is not smoking. For the first few months, you're just unhappy. For the first year, you're like depressed. And then you get to the point where you can't imagine you ever smoked.
Yeah, I find that, with my sugar experience, I could no way in a million years ever think I could kick the sugar habit. And then, Lori and I talk about it all the time. Your taste buds change. Things become too sweet for you, which is an insane concept that I would never have imagined me ever saying something like that. But you just get used to it and say,
And it's not like you're not aware. Like I could talk about warm beignets, which are what the French call donuts, because it's in France, they taste better, and I'll start salivating while I talk about it. I mean, I am aware of how good these things tasted.
Yeah.
But I don't miss them. If I'm sitting in a bakery, I got problems. Or if I'm out to dinner with my wife and she orders dessert, I'm going to stare at her dessert until she eventually just pushes it towards me and gets angry.
And you get a bite.
Eat it already. Yeah. And she can eat 2 bites and put it aside.
That's how I am. Yeah, that's what I do with my husband. He'll get the dessert and I'll have a bite or 2 and I'm good.
Yeah. I can't. I have to get the waitress to take it off the table.
That's like
the wait person to take it off the table, because otherwise I'm going to finish it. And sometimes they'll say, "Oh, the hell with it, just finish it, get it over with." And I know when I go home, I don't have bread pudding with blackberries.
Right.
In my house at home, I'm not going to be tempted. But that takes practice. That was one of the messages from the Case for Keto, and I have. Some of the lessons I learned from these physicians I interviewed, and really, really thoughtful doctors. And one of them says, look, it just takes practice. Like everything in life, if you want to do it well, you would never expect to be a good piano player off the bat.
I love that.
Or even
so well said.
Yeah. So it just takes, and you learn over the years how to do it and what your body can tolerate, and also when you can if you can jump off the wagon for one night, because you know that the next day you'll get back on. Whereas when it's all new, falling off the wagon could be the end of it for you. But that was true. You may not have that also.
Yeah. And I was going to say, you may not have that insulin sensitivity that helps you get right back on track too.
Yeah. So it's sort of, and that's the thing, your body gets used to fueling fat. I was just in Copenhagen giving lectures, and the people who invited me at the University of Copenhagen were not keto people. They were obesity researchers, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. But they took me out to eat at restaurants they liked, which is an entirely different experience when you give a conference at like a keto talk, And I found myself having butter cravings.
Interesting.
Because I wasn't
just not sugar, but yeah,
I wasn't getting enough fat at these restaurants. And all I wanted to do was sneak into the kitchen and say, look, can I have like a 1/4 pound of butter I could take home and eat in a hotel room later? And they'll think I'm insane. And I assume clearly this has to be giving me clogged arteries, despite all my research. But that's it.
You are so funny.
Yeah, I don't get sugar cravings. I get fat cravings.
Butter,
because my body burns fat for fuel. That's what it does. And you want it to burn fat rather than store it. So.
Listen, Gary, you've been an absolute joy. I'm so happy to actually have finally spoken to you. I would say I always have been a big fan. So I want you to just give us the opportunity, and the audience, of course, to your social media handles, your website, and just to follow you as much as
where we can find your books.
Where we find your books. So they can keep up with what you do, as well as me and Lori have been doing throughout the years. So you're an absolute gem. So appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. It's been great, guys. And the books, Amazon, wherever fine books are still sold. The Case for Keto is the last one, which I think, is for people who are really who want to know how to think about this, as the title once was. This is
and how to do it,
and how to do it, and how to keep doing it. And then, I have a website, GaryTaubes.com, where I don't do much anymore. I hope to have a Substack newsletter when I finish the diabetes book, but
excellent.
We'll see how that goes.
Well, we'd love to have you back on for that as well.
I would love to do it.
That would be wonderful.
It's a fascinating story, the diabetes diet story, and one that I wish diabetologists understood. I guess I'm writing it for them all, like 20 of them who are influential. But
there you go again, making waves.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you too, Gary. Really appreciate you.
All right. Have a great rest of the day.
Okay. Terrific.
Take care.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of This Podcast Burns Fat. We're so excited to have you as a listener, and we're hoping that you've really enjoyed the content as well. And if you did, please run over to iTunes and provide a rating and or review. It will go a long way in helping us continuously build our listenership up so that we can provide you with excellent content regarding fat loss, weight management, and just an overall healthy lifestyle. Thanks so much. Have a great night.